Scottish Gaelic, or Scots Gaelic, sometimes also referred to as Gaelic, is a Celtic language native to Scotland, a member of the Goidelic branch of the Celtic languages. Scottish Gaelic, like Modern Irish and Manx, developed out of Middle Irish, and thus is ultimately descended from Old Irish. The 2011 census of Scotland showed that a total of 57,375 people in Scotland could speak Gaelic at the time, with the Outer Hebrides being the main stronghold of the language. The census results indicate a decline of 1,275 Gaelic speakers from 2001. A total of 87,056 people in 2011 reported having some facility with Gaelic, compared to 93,282 people in 2001, a decline of 6,226. Despite this decline, revival efforts exist and the number of speakers of the language under age 20 has increased. Scottish Gaelic is not an official language of the European Union of the United Kingdom. However, it is classed as an indigenous language under the European Charter for Regional and Minority Languages, which the British government has ratified, and the Gaelic Language Act 2005 established a language development body, Goidelic, with a view to securing the status of the Gaelic language as an official language of Scotland. Outside Scotland, a group of dialects collectively known as Canadian Gaelic is spoken in parts of Atlantic Canada, mainly Nova Scotia and Prince Edward Island. In the 2011 census, there were 7,195 total speakers of Gaelic languages in Canada, with 1,365 in Nova Scotia and Prince Edward Island, where the responses mainly refer to Scottish Gaelic. About 2,320 Canadians in 2011 also claimed Gaelic languages as the mother tongue, with over 300 in Nova Scotia and Prince Edward Island. Nomenclature. Aside from Scottish Gaelic, the language may also be referred to simply as Gaelic. In Scotland, the word Gaelic, in reference to Scottish Gaelic specifically, is pronounced, while outside Scotland it is often pronounced ELK. Outside Ireland and Great Britain, Gaelic may refer to the Irish language. Scottish Gaelic should not be confused with Scots, the Middle English-derived language varieties which had come to be spoken in most of the lowlands of Scotland by the early modern era. Prior to the 15th century, these dialects were known as English by its own speakers, with Gaelic being called Scotus. For the late 15th century, however, it became increasingly common for such speakers to refer to Scottish Gaelic as Erse and the lowland vernacular as Scotus. Today, Scottish Gaelic is recognized as a separate language from Irish, so the word Erse in reference to Scottish Gaelic is no longer used. History. Origins to Zenith. It is commonly accepted by scholars today that Gaelic was brought to Scotland, probably in the 4th–5th centuries CE, by settlers from Ireland who founded the Gaelic kingdom of Dalriata on Scotland's west coast in present-day Argyll. Gaelic in Scotland was mostly confined to Dalriata until the 8th century, when it began expanding into Pictish areas north of the Firth of Forth and the Firth of Clyde. This was spurred by the intermarriage of Gaelic and Pictish aristocratic families, the political merger of the two kingdoms in the early 9th century, and the common threat of attack by Norse invaders. By 900 Pictish appears to have become extinct, completely replaced by Gaelic. An exception might be made for the Northern Isles, however, where Pictish was more likely supplanted by Norse rather than by Gaelic. During the reign of Constantine mac Aidia, outsiders began to refer to the region as the Kingdom of Alba rather than the Kingdom of the Picts, but we do not know whether this was because a new kingdom was established or Alba was simply a closer approximation of the Pictish name for the Picts. However, though the Pictish language did not disappear suddenly, a process of Gaelicization was clearly underway during the reigns of Constantine and his successors. By a certain point, probably during the 11th century, all the inhabitants of Alba had become fully Gaelicized Scots, and Pictish identity was forgotten. By the 10th century, Gaelic had become the dominant language throughout northern and western Scotland. The Gaelo-Pictic Kingdom of Alba, it spread to southern Scotland, was less even and totalizing. Place name analysis suggests dense usage of Gaelic in Galloway and adjoining areas to the north and west, as well as in West Lothian and parts of Western Midlothian. Less dense usage is suggested for North Ayrshire, Renfrewshire, the Clyde Valley and eastern Dumfriesshire. This latter region is roughly the area of the Old Kingdom of Strathclyde, which was annexed by the Kingdom of Alba in the early 11th century, but may have continued to speak Cumbric as late as the 12th century. In southeastern Scotland, there is no evidence that Gaelic was ever widely spoken. The area shifted from Cumbric to Old English during its long incorporation into the Anglo-Saxon Kingdom of Northumbria. After the Lothians were conquered by Malcolm II at the Battle of Carham in 1018, elites spoke Gaelic and continued to do so down to c. 1200. However, commoners retained Old English. With the incorporation of Strathclyde and the Lothians, Gaelic reached its social, cultural, political, and geographic zenith in Scotland. The language in Scotland had been developing features independently of the language in Ireland at least as early as its crossing the Drûm-Alban into Pictland. The entire country was for the first time being referred to in Latin as Scotia, and Gaelic was recognized as the lingua Scotia. Eclipse of Gaelic in Scotland. Many historians mark the reign of King Malcolm Candmore as the beginning of Gaelic's eclipse in Scotland. In either 1068 or 1070, the king married the exiled Princess Margaret of Wessex. This future St. Margaret of Scotland was a member of the royal house of Wessex, which had occupied the English throne from its founding until the Norman conquest. Margaret was thoroughly Anglo-Saxon and is often credited for taking the first significant steps in Anglicizing the Scottish court. She spoke no Gaelic, gave her children Anglo-Saxon rather than Gaelic names, and brought many English bishops, priests, and monastics to Scotland. Her family also served as a conduit for the entry of English nobles into Scotland. When both Malcolm and Margaret died just days apart in 1093, the Gaelic aristocracy rejected their Anglicized sons and instead backed Malcolm's brother Donald as the next King of Scots. Known as Donald Ban, the new king had lived 17 years in Ireland as a young man, and his power base as an adult was in the thoroughly Gaelic west of Scotland. Upon Donald's ascension to the throne, in the words of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the Scots drove out all the English who had been with King Malcolm. Malcolm's sons fled to the English court, but in 1097 returned with an Anglo-Norman army backing them. Donald was overthrown, blinded, and imprisoned for the remaining 2 years of his life. Because of the strong English ties of Malcolm's sons Edgar, Alexander, and David, each of whom became king in turn, Donald Ban is sometimes called the last Celtic king of Scotland. He was the last Scottish monarch to be buried on Iona, the one-time centre of the Scottish Gaelic Church and the traditional burial place of the Gaelic kings of Da Dalriada and the Kingdom of Alba. During the reigns of the sons of Malcolm Cant More, Anglo-Norman names and practices spread throughout Scotland south of the Fourth Clyde Line and along the northeastern coastal plain as far north as Moray. Norman French became dominant among the new feudal aristocracy, especially in southern Scotland, and completely displaced Gaelic at court. The establishment of royal burghs throughout the same area, particularly under David I, attracted large numbers of foreigners speaking English, the language of the merchant class. This was the beginning of Gaelic's status as a predominantly rural language in Scotland. The country experienced significant population growth in the 12th and 13th centuries in the expanding burghs and the nearby agricultural districts. These economic developments surely helped spread English as well. Gaelic still retained some of its old prestige in medieval Scotland. At the coronation of King Alexander III in 1249, a traditional Sean-Chide storyteller recited the king's full genealogy in Gaelic all the way back to Fergus More, the mythical progenitor of the Scots in Dalriada, in accordance with the custom which had grown up in the kingdom from antiquity right up to the time. Clan chiefs in the northern and western parts of Scotland continued to support Gaelic bards who remained a central feature of court life there. The semi-independent lordship of the Isles in the Hebrides and western coastal mainland remained thoroughly Gaelic since the language's recovery there in the 12th century, providing a political foundation for cultural prestige down to the end of the 15th century. That being said, it seems clear that Gaelic had ceased to be the language of all of Scotland by 1400 at the latest. It disappeared from the central lowlands by c. 1350 and from the eastern coastal lowlands north of the Mount not long afterwards. By the mid-14th century, what eventually came to be called Scots emerged as the official language of government and law. Scotland's emergent nationalism in the era following the conclusion of the Wars of Scottish Independence was organised using Scots as well. For example, the nation's great patriotic literature, including John Barbour's The Bruce and Blind Harry's The Wallace, was written in Scots, not Gaelic. It was around this time that the very name of Gaelic began to change. Down through the 14th century, Gaelic was referred to in English as Scots, i.e. the language of the Scots. By the end of the 15th century, however, the Scottish dialect of Northern English had absorbed that designation. English Scots speakers referred to Gaelic instead as Irish or i.e. Irish. King James IV thought Gaelic important enough to learn and speak. However, he was the last Scottish monarch to do so. Modern era Scottish Gaelic has a rich oral and written tradition, referred to as Buailthras in Scottish Gaelic, having been the language of the bardic culture of the Highland clans for many years. The language preserves knowledge of and adherence to pre-feudal tribal laws and customs. The language suffered particularly as Highlanders and the traditions were persecuted after the Battle of Culloden in 1746, and during the Highland clearances. An Irish Gaelic translation of the Bible dating from the Elizabethan period was in use until the Bible was translated into Scottish Gaelic. Author David Ross notes in his 2002 History of Scotland that a Scottish Gaelic version of the Bible was published in London in 1690 by the Rev. Robert Kirk, minister of Aberfoyle. However, it was not widely circulated. The first well-known translation of the Bible into Scottish Gaelic was made in 1767 when Dr. James Stewart of Killen and Dugald Buchanan of Rannoch produced a translation of the New Testament. Very few European languages have made the transition to a modern literary language without an early modern translation of the Bible. The lack of a well-known translation until the late 18th century may have contributed to the decline of Scottish Gaelic. Pre-feudal attitudes antedating the Jacobite rebellions and Highland clearances were still evident in the complaints and claims of the Highland Land League of the late 19th century. This political movement was successful in getting members elected to the Parliament of the United Kingdom. The Land League was dissipated as a parliamentary force by the 1886 Crofters Act, and by the way the Liberal Party was seen to become supportive of Land League objectives. In the 21st century, Scottish Gaelic literature has seen development within the area of prose fiction publication, as well as challenges due to the continuing decline of the language. The Gaelic phrase Albagubrath is still used today as a catchphrase, a rallying cry. Defunct dialects. All surviving dialects are Highland and or Hebridean dialects. Dialects of Lowland Gaelic have become defunct since the demise of Galwegian Gaelic, originally spoken in Galloway, which seems to have been the last Lowland dialect and which survived into the modern period. By the 18th century, Lowland Gaelic had been largely replaced by Lowland Scots across much of Lowland Scotland, according to a reference in the Carrick Covenanters by James Crichton. The last place in the Lowlands where Scottish Gaelic was still spoken was the village of Bar in Carrick. Crichton gives neither date nor details. There is, however, no evidence of a linguistic border following the topographical north-south differences. Similarly, there is no evidence from place names of significant linguistic differences between, for example, Argyll and Galloway. Dialects on both sides of the Straits of Moyle linking Scottish Gaelic with Irish are now extinct, though native speakers were still to be found on the Mull of Kintyre, Rathlin, and in Northeast Ireland as late as the mid-20th century. Records of the speech show that Irish and Scottish Gaelic existed in a dialect chain with no clear language boundary. Today, the closest tied Irish dialect with Highland Gaelic is Ulster Irish, spoken in County Donegal, most notably the Jaith Dobhair Gaeltacht. Written Ulster Irish, as well as common grammatical and vocabulary traits, reflects more archaic Classical Gaelic, still providing more of a solid link between the two languages than with official Standard Irish, based on the dialects of southern provinces. However, to claim that Ulster Irish is a perfect intermediate between the Irish and Scottish forms of Gaelic still remains perhaps an exaggerated statement. What is known as Scottish Gaelic is essentially that of the Gaelic spoken in the Outer Hebrides and on Skye. Generally speaking, the Gaelic spoken across the Western Isles is similar enough to be classed as one major dialect group, although there is still regional variation. For example, the pronunciation of the slender R, as in Lewis, where the Gaelic is thought to have a unique Nordic accent, and is described as being tonal. Gaelic in eastern and southern Scotland is now largely defunct, although the dialects which were spoken in the east tended to preserve a more archaic tone, which had been lost further west. For example, Gaelic speakers in East Sutherland prefer to say California D Rob 2M Oichi Araooir, rather than the more common Kate and Rob Thu Araooir. Such dialects also retain the classical Gaelic values of the stops, as do Manx and Irish Gaelic. A certain number of these dialects, which are now defunct in Scotland, have been preserved and, indeed, re-established within the Nova Scotia Gaelic community. Those of particular note are the Mora and Lochaber dialects, the latter of which pronounces the broader velarized L as AW. Status. Number of speakers. The 1755 to 2001 figures are census data quoted by Macaulay. The 2011 Gaelic speakers figures come from Table KS 206 SC of the 2011 census. The 2011 total population figure comes from Table KS 101SC. Note that the numbers of Gaelic speakers relate to the numbers aged 3 and over, and the percentages are calculated using those and the number of the total population aged 3 and over. Distribution in Scotland. The 2011 UK census showed a total of 57,375 Gaelic speakers in Scotland. Compared to the 2001 census, there has been a diminution of approximately 1,300 people. This is the smallest drop between censuses since the Gaelic language question was first asked in 1881, which the Scottish government's language minister and board Goidelic took as evidence that Gaelic's long decline has slowed. The main stronghold of the language continues to be the Outer Hebrides, where the overall proportion of speakers is at 52.2%. Important pockets of the language also exist in the Highlands and in Argyll and Bute. While mostly a language of small towns and rural areas, Gaelic's urban centre is Inverness, where 4.9% speak the language. The locality with the largest absolute number is Glasgow, with 5,878 such persons, who make up over 10% of all of Scotland's Gaelic speakers. Gaelic continues to decline in its traditional heartland. Between 2001 and 2011, the absolute number of Gaelic speakers fell sharply in the Western Isles, Argyll and Amp, Bute, and Highland. The drop in Stornoway, the largest parish in the Western Isles by population, was especially acute, down from 57.5% of the population in 1991 to 43.4% in 2011. The only parish outside the Western Isles over 40% Gaelic-speaking is Culmuir in Northern Skye at 46%. Outside the Outer Hebrides, the only areas with significant percentages of Gaelic speakers are the Inner Hebridean islands of Tiree, Rathie, Skye, Lismore, Colonsay, and Islay. Continued decline in the traditional Gaelic heartland has been recently balanced by growth in other parts of Scotland. Between the 2001 and 2011 censuses, the number of Gaelic speakers rose in 19 of the country's 32 council areas. The largest absolute gains were in Aberdeenshire, North Lanarkshire, Aberdeen City, and East Ayrshire. The largest relative gains were in Aberdeenshire, East Ayrshire, Moray, and Orkney. Because of the continued decline of Gaelic in its traditional heartland, today no civil parish in Scotland has a proportion of Gaelic speakers greater than 65%. In addition, no civil parish on mainland Scotland has a proportion of Gaelic speakers greater than 20%. From a total of 871 civil parishes in Scotland, 7 have a proportion of Gaelic speakers greater than 50%. 14 have a proportion of Gaelic speakers greater than 25%, and 35 have a proportion of Gaelic speakers greater than 10%. As with other Celtic languages, monolingualism is non-existent except among native-speaking children under school age in traditional Gaidel-attached regions. In 2014, the census of pupils in Scotland showed 497 pupils in publicly funded schools had Gaelic as the main language at home, a drop of 18% from 606 students in 2010. During the same period, Gaelic medium education in Scotland has grown, with 3,583 pupils being educated in a Gaelic immersion environment in 2014, up from 2,638 pupils in 2009. Writing system. Alphabet. Prehistoric Irish, the precursor to Old Irish, in turn the precursor to Modern Irish, Scottish Gaelic and Manx, was written in a carved writing called Otham. often consisted of marks made above or below a horizontal line. With the advent of Christianity in the 5th century, the Latin alphabet was introduced to Ireland. The Goidelic languages have historically been part of a dialect continuum stretching from the south of Ireland, the Isle of Man, to the north of Scotland. The modern Scottish Gaelic alphabet has 18 letters: A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, L, M, N, O, P, R, S, T, U. The letter H, now mostly used to indicate lenition of a consonant, was in general not used in the oldest orthography, as lenition was instead indicated with a dot over the lenited consonant. The letters of the alphabet were traditionally named after trees, but this custom has fallen out of use. Long vowels are marked with a grave accent, indicated through digraphs or conditioned by certain consonant environments. Traditional spelling systems also use the acute accent on the letters e acute to denote a change in vowel quality rather than length. But reform from within the Scottish school system has abandoned these in parts of Gaelic-speaking society. Certain early sources used only an acute accent along the lines of Irish, particularly in the 18th century sources such as in the writings of Alex MacDonald and the earliest editions of Don Chardban Mac and Tsaoir. Orthography. Classical Gaelic was used as a literary language in Scotland until the 18th century. Orthographic divergence between Scottish Gaelic and Irish is the result of more recent orthographic reforms resulting in a pluricentric language situation. The 1767 New Testament historically set the standard for Scottish Gaelic. Around the time of World War II, Irish spelling was reformed and the official standard Id Noifajoi introduced. Further reform in 1957 eliminated some of the silent letters that are still used in Scottish Gaelic. The 1981 Scottish Examination Board recommendations for Scottish Gaelic, the Gaelic Orthographic Conventions, were adopted by most publishers and agencies, although they remain controversial among some academics, most notably Ronald Black. The quality of consonants is indicated in writing by the vowels surrounding them. So-called slender consonants are palatalized while broad consonants and neutral are velarized. The vowels E and I are classified as slender, and A, O, and U as broad. The spelling rule known as Calrecul agus Lethan Re Lethan requires that a word medial consonant a constant group followed by a written I, or E be also preceded by an I or E, and similarly if followed by A, O, U be also preceded by an O or U. Consonant quality is then indicated by the vowels written adjacent to a consonant, and the spelling rule gives the benefit of removing possible uncertainty about consonant quality at the expense of adding additional purely graphic vowels that may not be pronounced. For example, compare the T in slainter with the T in barter. The rule has no effect on the pronunciation of vowels. For example, plurals in Gaelic are often formed with the suffix an, for example, brog, brogan. But because of the spelling rule, the suffix is spelled in after a slender consonant, as in Tetaian, where the written E is purely a graphic vowel inserted to conform with the spelling rule because an I precedes the GH. In changes promoted by the Scottish Examination Board from 1976 onwards, certain modifications were made to this rule. For example, the suffix of the past participle is always spelled te, even after a broad consonant, as in togte, raise. Where pairs of vowels occur in writing, it is sometimes unclear which vowel is to be pronounced and which vowel has been introduced to satisfy this spelling rule. Unstressed vowels omitted in speech can be omitted in informal writing. For example, tami and otches, and gt, tami, and otches. Once Gaelic orthographic rules have been learned, the pronunciation of the written language is in general quite predictable. However, learners must be careful not to try to apply English sound to letter correspondences to written Gaelic. Otherwise mispronunciations will result. Gaelic personal names such as Sinead are especially likely to be mispronounced by English speakers. Scots English orthographic rules have also been used at various times in Gaelic writing. Notable examples of Gaelic verse composed in this manner are the Book of the Dún of Lismore and the Fernig manuscript. Pronunciation. Most varieties of Gaelic have between 8 and 9 vowel phonemes that can be either long or short. There are also 2 reduced vowels which only occur short. Although some vowels are strongly nasal, instances of distinctive nasality are rare. There are about 9 diphthongs and a few triphthongs. Most consonants have both palatal and non-palatal counterparts, including a very rich system of liquids, nasals and trills. The historically voiced stops have lost the voicing, so the phonemic contrast today is between unaspirated and aspirated. In many dialects, these stops may however gain voicing through secondary articulation through preceding nasal. For examples, Doras, door, bud and doris. The door has or. In some fixed phrases, these changes are shown permanently, as the link with the base words has been lost, as in Andrasta, now, from Antrathsar, this time, period. In medial and final position, the aspirated stops are pre-aspirated rather than aspirated.